This is Laura Podolsky, the Policy Director of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. Just so everyone knows they're in the right place, this webinar is the strategies for transitioning to low carbon emission trucks in the United States. This webinar is brought to you by the Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways Program, the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, and the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy, all here at UC Davis as a part of the Institute for Transportation Studies program. This webinar builds upon the work and the preliminary findings from a draft white paper from the STEPS program and the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. And this paper is being developed by our two speakers today. So we'll be hearing from them about some of their work and, again, preliminary findings. This white paper is, you guessed it, examining the strategies for transitioning to low-carbon trucks in the United States. Again, the paper is still in draft, so the speakers are excited today to be holding this webinar because it provides an additional opportunity for input and commentary from those participating in the webinar today. So for today's webinar, we will be spending the first half hearing from our speakers and featured guest respondents, and then we'll be dedicating the second half of the webinar to questions and answers with all of you. So I hope all of you have come with some really interesting questions that you will pitch to our speakers and respondents. I'd like to point out that, as everyone hopefully can tell, that you are muted. So if you hear dogs barking, people talking, phones ringing, you know who to blame, and that is us. So if you do have a question for our speakers, then please type those in the chat box that is located in the lower left hand of your screen. You can also use this chat box to let us know if you're running into any technical issues, and we'll do our best to help you. Also, we are recording this webinar and posting it on our event page for later viewing. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers and special guest respondents today. So our speakers are Dr. Lou Fulton and Marshall Miller, both from the Institute of Transportation Studies here at UC Davis. Dr. Lou Fulton has worked internationally in the field of transport, energy, environment analysis, and policy development for over 20 years. He is a co-director of the Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways, or STEPS program, within the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Here he leads a range of research activities around new vehicle technologies and new fuels. Dr. Marshall Miller joined the Institute of Transportation Studies here at UC Davis, and for over 20 years he has worked on advancing fuels and technologies to increase vehicle fuel economy and reduce vehicle criteria pollutants and greenhouse gases. Dr. Miller runs a laboratory on campus where he studies advanced batteries and ultracapacitors for use in electric and hybrid vehicles. We are also very excited to be joined by two leaders in the field as our special guest respondents today. We have Todd Sachs, who is the Assistant Chief of the Mobile Source Control Division at the California Air Resources Board. The Mobile Source Control Division is responsible for incentive and regulatory program development and implementation focused on heavy-duty vehicles and equipment. Todd earned his doctorate in environmental science and engineering from UCLA in 2004. We also have Bill Van Amberg, and he is the Senior Vice President of CalSTART, the nation's leading clean transportation technology organization. He has over 35 years of experience, including technology development, commercialization, and marketing. At CalSTART, he oversees efficiency trucks, new fuels, and clean transportation consulting. He is also knowledgeable about environmental market mechanisms such as emission credits. So again, I'd like to thank our speakers and guest respondents today. And without further ado, I hand it over to our speakers, Lou Fulton and Marshall Miller.
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be doing this webinar, and with the great crowd that we're getting to listen in. We'll try to summarize this paper as best we can in the time available, and we look forward to the comments because the paper is still a work in progress. We're still taking comments and revising, and we look forward to improving and hopefully releasing this paper within another week or two. I will get into the meat of it in a second. I'd like to start by just a very quick advertisement for our STEPS program here. We've had this program, which is part of the Institute of Transportation Studies. It's the Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways Program. It's existed now for about 17 years. We're starting what's called Steps 3, and it will be an interesting 4-year research track with lots of new research and great sponsorship. And I'm happy to share more information about that with people if they are interested. But that's all I'll say about it right now. And I'll also mention that one of the last features of the previous 4-year research program, which we called Next Steps, is a series of white papers. And this is one of those white papers, and you can see the schedule here that as we roll them out. But 4 of them are already available on our website, and we welcome people to go and take a look at those. And this one will soon join those. So today we want to talk about this sustainable, low-carbon truck project that we've been undertaking. This is part of a range of different kinds of freight research that we're doing here at UC Davis, and I would have to call this a high-level view at what are the technologies and fuels available and what are the barriers and the challenges to try to use those to achieve a very low-carbon future in trucking in both the United States and in California, looking out to 2050. And we look a little bit at the policy implications of our scenarios. These are the team that's been involved. It's really been myself and Marshall who've been the main authors here, so we're the ones who are on the hot seat and have to apologize for any errors and stuff like that. But we've had a lot of data inputs from others within our program, and of course from outside the program we've drawn on a lot of important literature out there. And we have used a model that was developed by Ben Sharp while he was a student here, and that's been very helpful. Why do we care about trucks? Well, an important reason when it comes to energy and CO2 emissions is that although they don't use as much energy in the United States as light-duty vehicles, they are growing more rapidly. And in fact, light-duty vehicles are pretty much in a flat energy use phase and are expected to decline. So this is the brand new AEO, the Energy Information Administration AEO 2015. And we see that really the big growth in energy use is expected to come from trucks. So this is everything from light commercial trucks up through the big Class 8s, long-haul tractor-trailer trucks, and it also includes buses. And those are all included in our study that we'll be presenting today. So it's clearly where the growth is expected to happen. And, of course, this is energy use, so it's after what the IEA thinks would happen in a baseline world in terms of truck travel growth, which is even higher. In fact, in the U.S. context, the EIA projects about a 70% increase in truck travel growth between 2012 and 2050. It's somewhat lower in California, according to the ARB Vision projection, although they have new projections coming out soon. The study that we're presenting today really zooms in on parts of a much bigger set of issues. Okay, apparently I'm not clear. I'm going to speak a little more close to the mic. Usually I'm so loud that it's not a problem, but okay, I'll be louder. We are basically taking as a starting point the possibility of, or the potential effort to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from trucking in the U.S. and California by 80% in 2050. This is a stated goal in California, and President Obama has stated it as an important target for the United States. And then we did have yesterday the executive order from Governor Brown to meet a 40% reduction below 1990 levels of greenhouse gases in California by 2030. We have not looked at that target, although we will show you something about meeting that target in this paper, and we may in the next week try to quickly backfill a little bit to show how our scenarios, what they have to say about that kind of a 2030 target. What we're not trying to do here is look at a range of potentially very important measures to change the amount of truck travel and the in-use efficiency of truck travel, which could be achieved through a whole range of things like intelligent transportation systems, automation, better traffic management, information and communication technologies for logistics. All of that stuff's outside the scope. We're focused on accepting a certain truck travel trajectory and how could you use vehicle and fuel technologies, including efficiency and alternative fuels, to achieve low greenhouse gases. So an important follow-on to what we're doing would be to try to better understand the contribution we could have from these other measures. A comment on biofuels, and we'll come back to this, and really the three fuel options for decarbonization are hydrogen, electricity, and biofuels. And we just wanted to caveat that we have not looked closely at renewable natural gas for this scenario. We acknowledge that this is another potentially important pathway. We have a separate study ongoing to look at potentials of RNG. So the biofuels in this scenario, in the scenarios we present today, are mainly drop-in renewable diesel types of scenarios. Okay, so that is the backdrop. Here's a punchline up front, because I can already tell it's 10 after. We're going to have to speed up a little bit. This is the high-level results of two scenarios, the main two scenarios in the paper, and we'll try to explain how we get to these scenarios in the coming slides. You see 2010 for both California and the U.S., and please notice that the right-hand axis is, for the U.S. shows that we're talking about 10 times more fuel in the U.S. than in California in 2010. And in 2050, we have a high ZEV scenario, which is attempting to reach the 80% target almost entirely through the penetration of fuel cell vehicles and electric vehicles in trucks. And incidentally, we do not assume any electric long-haul trucking. That's certainly something that we could talk about, but we have, or heavy-duty short-haul, actually, it's all fuel cells for the heavy-duty trucks. And then there's a lot of electrification in medium and light commercial trucks. We also have a mixed scenario, which we cut the penetration of ZEVs by half, and the rates of penetrations start later, and we make up for that with the adoption of quite a significant amount of biofuels. And in this slide, we show that the biofuels at the U.S. level would be about a doubling of the current biofuels used in transportation, and would be very different than the ethanol that dominates today. These would be drop-in renewable diesel types of fuels, and they would have to come from cellulosic feedstocks, or at least very low carbon net greenhouse gas pathways by 2050. The hydrogen is also a huge increase compared to today. It's a doubling roughly of the total hydrogen industrial production in the United States today, but almost none of that goes to transportation. So for transport, it's a couple of orders or several orders of magnitude increase. But we do produce a lot of hydrogen in the United States. Okay, I'm going to now hand it over to Marshall for the next few slides.
Okay, thanks, Lou. So the trucking sector is fairly complex and includes a variety of different truck types that all have fairly distinct characteristics. There's long and short-haul trucks. These are the Class 7 and Class 8, very large trucks. Long-haul trucks drive very high mileage, and the vast majority of that is highway travel. Short-haul trucks drive high mileage, but nowhere near as high as long-haul. And their travel is typically much more urban, a lot of low speed, and a very significant amount of idling. Those short-haul trucks include what we call port trucks as well. There's heavy and medium-duty vocational. Those are refuse trucks, trash compactors, bucket trucks. They also have very different drive cycles, very low fuel economies, typically medium levels of mileage per year. There's medium-duty urban trucks, which are delivery trucks, FedEx, UPS trucks, again, medium mileage per year. Buses, those are transit, shuttle, and coach. Transit buses typically drive at relatively low speeds, urban travel, lots of stops and starts. Shuttles and coaches are a little more light-duty vehicles. Oops. What's happening? And finally, we have the heavy-duty vans and pickup trucks. These are Class 2B and 3. They typically drive much more like light-duty vehicles, have medium 20,000 to 30,000 miles per year, and much higher fuel economy than the other vehicles on this slide. The variation in fuel economy is really quite large. Heavy-duty vocational trucks have fuel economies typically less than 3 miles per gallon, and that ranges up to the heavy-duty vans and pickup trucks, which might be in the 15 miles per gallon range. Okay, so these trucks will use a variety of technologies and fuels. Right now, the entire trucking sector is dominated by conventional diesel and gasoline vehicles. The problem with these is they have relatively high emissions of greenhouse gases. There is some commercial natural gas trucks, hybrid trucks. The natural gas typically are in buses and in the medium-duty urban delivery trucks. And fuel cells and battery electrics are in demonstration programs and not really commercial at the moment. And all of these technologies and fuels, there's a large variation in efficiency, potential efficiency, and they all have various issues or barriers. For example, with fuel cells, the hydrogen infrastructure is lacking. There's a question of whether, for a number of the trucks, the current fuel cell engines can last the lifetime of the vehicle. So presumably over time, that technology has to increase to allow that to occur. Okay, this slide shows some of the fuel economy numbers that we've used for long-haul heavy-duty trucks. All the highway travel, the advantage of hybridization is not so large for this type of truck. Diesel trucks in 2030, we assume, have some modifications that increase fuel economy, not quite 50%. We show 9.3 here. We have a category called diesel maximum technology. That's with all the bells and whistles. So you have lower weight, lower aerodynamic drag, low rolling resistance, and not optimized, but very high diesel engine efficiency. And we project about 11.2 miles per gallon. So it's almost a doubling of fuel economy from the conventional vehicles now. And you see fuel cell with liquid hydrogen is higher still, and we get up by 2030 to about 13.3 miles per gallon. The bottom row shows for a 500-mile range, roughly the volume of fuel storage necessary. And you see for diesel and current hybrids, that's in the mid-70s. As you get to advanced diesel and the maximum tech diesel, that can drop down to around 50. But you see for fuel cells, because liquid hydrogen has a relatively low fuel density, energy density, you get very high or much higher volumetric requirements, 225 to 300, depending on the time scale.
Okay, back to me. I'm going to be brief about costs, and there's a lot more details in the paper, but we did do a societal cost analysis. We made a lot of assumptions about the possible reduction in technology costs through 2030, and I won't go through this slide in detail, but we did a fairly standard life cycle cost analysis with a 4% discount rate, and this is not the same thing as doing an analysis of how truck purchase behavior might be. And in fact, one of the follow-up studies we're interested in doing is looking at vehicle choice behavior among trucking companies and shippers. The results of this, very briefly, are that, and then I'll give a little bit of the background to some of these results. In the near term, we see that the costs of natural gas. This is incidentally using 2014 fuel cost data and what we're calling near-term data for truck technologies. So it's the one technology that really stands out as being treated somewhat differently is hydrogen fuel cell trucks, because we don't have a lot of them yet, and we've used a relatively higher cost than what you would expect from a large-scale commercial situation. We've used specifically a $200 per kilowatt cost for the fuel cell, and in a high-volume situation, that might be much lower. We do lower it down to under $50 per kilowatt for 2030. But I think the main message here is that none of these, especially in the long run, none of these technologies, when you take into account 15 years of fuel at a 4% discount rate, look particularly, there's no showstoppers here in terms of cost. I think in the near term, the costs of biodiesel and fuel cells would be pretty high, but in the long run, these costs come down. It does depend, especially for fuel cells, on reaching these high volume and a lot of learning over the next 15 years. The same slide for short-haul heavy duties, and I guess we actually do have some electricity in the short-haul heavy duties. We don't have a lot, but we're using these two truck classes as an example. We're not going to show everything here. But with the electricity added, first of all, you have less driving from these kinds of trucks in all urban trucks compared to long haul. So the fuel cost savings isn't as beneficial, for example, with natural gas as it is for long haul. And you see that electricity and hydrogen fuel cells are pretty expensive in the near term. But again, this comes down quite a bit over time, and they're not nearly as much more expensive by 2030. One of the key parts to this is how we treat alternative fuels. And in terms of what we're assuming around hydrogen, electricity, and biofuels, this slide describes the pathways that we're assuming, and to some extent that you would have to have, both in terms of achieving the greenhouse gas targets, but it also tells us something about the cost of these fuels. So very briefly, here we have in 2014 pretty much how we make these fuels today. In 2050, on the right-hand side, you have this sort of promised land of where we really need to get. We need to have something like an 80% or greater reduction in greenhouse gases from the fuel pathways themselves in order to achieve this 80% reduction as we shift to these fuels. So you have to have very high usage of these fuels, and they have to be deeply decarbonized. So we are assuming a deep decarbonization of the electricity grid, which helps both hydrogen and electricity. There may also be the possibility of producing hydrogen from what you might call excess wind and solar, and that's a very interesting sort of sub-pathway where you might have enough wind and solar available to produce almost zero-carbon hydrogen because the electricity isn't needed from those power sources at certain times of day. And then for biofuels, we're assuming 100% very low greenhouse gas renewable diesel, and that's certainly a controversial area. And I think the big question is how much of that can you expect to have, and you need a lot in this scenario. And then 2030 is sort of in between. We're assuming you're about halfway in this transition, and that your grid, electricity grid is partially decarbonized. You're getting a lot of renewable diesel, and you're getting a lot of hydrogen through electrolysis by 2030. It's important to be well on the way in this kind of transition. And if you can do this, you get these pictures of CO2, and you again, I don't have time to spend a lot of time on this slide, but you get by 2030 for both long haul and short haul fairly deep decarbonization, especially for advanced biodiesel and hydrogen fuel cells, and by 2050 it would be even lower. But you're already in pretty, you've made a lot of progress by 2030 in the assumptions that we're making here. Couple of slides on what happens to the cost when you put those CO2 numbers in there. This is with a $50 per ton carbon value, and we're saying this isn't a game changer, although in the 2030 numbers, it almost is a game changer. This carbon CO2 cost for diesel would be high enough that it makes advanced biofuels and fuel cell vehicles for long-haul trucks, pretty competitive, and it's more or less a similar story for short haul. And it would be fun to talk about this more, but we're going to move on and over to the scenarios that we made and back to Marshall.
So the truck scenarios we carried out, we used the top HDV model. And these scenarios are not meant to be a prediction of the future. They're meant to explore what would happen if you chose a particular pathway aiming at the goal of 80% reductions and to find out what you would have to do to reach that goal. So in these scenarios, we use vehicle stock, vehicle miles traveled for each truck type through 2050, and we modify sales of new technologies to enter into the fleet in order to reach the goal at 2050 of the 80% reductions. As mentioned, we looked at two pathways. The first pathway is heavily ZEVs. A major advantage is that not only can you reduce greenhouse gases significantly, but you also reduce criteria pollutants significantly, and that's very important in California. The vehicles are initially very expensive, and as I mentioned, fuel cells are lacking in hydrogen infrastructure. The electricity and hydrogen for the ZEVs need to be produced almost exclusively renewably to get the carbon content down very low. For biofuels and ZEVs mix, the biofuels, the benefit of that is that you do not require new vehicles. Essentially, the biofuels are drop-in ready, so any changes you make, slight modifications to the diesel trucks, the biofuels can, there's no other modifications necessary for the fuel. One concern with biofuels is it's not clear how much low-carbon biofuels are available, and especially in the quantities needed for trucks and for other vehicles to potentially meet the 80% reduction. It's also unsure, well, the estimates of actual carbon emissions from biofuels have large uncertainties. Okay, what we show here is for our ZEV scenario, we have the truck VMT by vehicle and fuel type in 3 time slices. The one on the left is 2010, in the middle is 2030, and the one on the right is 2050. So each of these time slices include the different vehicle types, short, long haul, buses, pickups, and so on. And each bar is broken down by the type of technology used, so diesel, fuel cell, battery electric, and so on. And in 2010, you can see it's almost exclusively diesel. There's a little bit of natural gas. By 2030, you start to see penetration, significant penetration of hybrids, a little bit more natural gas. You also start to see some battery electrics and some fuel cells. But the fuel cells, those are the orange, and battery electrics are the lighter blue. You can still, at that moment, at 2030, have still very modest VMT or fleet stock penetration. By 2050, you see almost a complete overhaul from 2010, but also almost a very significant overhaul from 2030. Almost all the VMT is taken by fuel cells or battery electric vehicles. So this slide shows not stock or VMT, but vehicle sales. And this is just for heavy-duty, long-haul and short-haul trucks. So the top plot shows the ZEV scenario, and you see it goes from 2015 up to 2050. The light blue is conventional diesel trucks, and you see those basically going to zero sales around 2030. The blue-gray is what we call the diesel maximum technology, very high efficiency. That starts to kick in pretty much right away, but again goes to zero around the 2040 timeline. The red is fuel cell, and in this scenario we start around 2022, quite early, and by 2025 you see the beginning of a very aggressive introduction of fuel cells into the fleet. And by 2040, almost 100% of the truck sales are fuel cells. By 2050, it's 100%. So that's a very, very aggressive scenario. And to modify that, we have the mixed scenario where include biofuels. And you see essentially the same. The light blue is the conventional diesel that goes away around 2030. The blue-gray is the diesel maximum technology. That plays a much more significant role, does not go away by 2050. And the fuel cells have a much less aggressive introduction. So by 2050, fuel cells and the diesel max technology are roughly 50% of vehicle sales. But by that time, the diesel trucks are fueled almost exclusively by very low carbon biofuels. This plot shows sort of the same thing, but focuses on the introduction in vehicle sales of the ZEVs into the fleet. The blue curve shows the ZEV scenario, and you see it starting a little after 2020 and ramping up very aggressively starting in 2025. The red line shows the mixed scenario with biofuels, and you can see we start a little later, but not enormously later. The ramp up is still significant, but it's not as aggressive as the ZEV scenario. So this slide shows the same plot that we showed earlier in the talk. So I won't really focus on that, but that's basically the fuel used in the different scenarios, 2010 and the high ZEV and the mixed scenario. The two takeaways are you can see this fuel use is in diesel gallons in diesel gallon equivalent. The reductions in the high ZEV scenario is almost 50% just from fuel efficiency in fuel use. The mixed scenario is a little bit less than 50%, but there are very significant reductions due to purely efficiency gains, and that's critical. The other thing that's critical is that all of the fuels used, hydrogen, electricity, and biofuels, must be deeply decarbonized by 2050. Otherwise, you won't reach the 80% goal by 2050.
Okay, thanks, Marshall. And this is our last slide, and it's trying to condense all of our policy and research reactions and findings into one slide. Clearly, these are very challenging scenarios, and this is not going to happen without very strong underpinning of policy. And of course, the policymakers in California and Washington realize this. And we have very interesting freight strategy that's being developed by ARB, for example, with a lot of elements that speak to trying to get on track for this kind of scenario. We do think that the national and the California efficiency/greenhouse gas standards for trucks will be a critical element, and this is already underway. We've got EPA revising their greenhouse gas standards, and California working on this. So we do think that this is absolutely fundamental to achieving this scenario. We also think it would take major rapid shifts in propulsion systems and fuel pathways to hit an 80 and 50 target. Hitting a, shall we say, 40 in 30 target, 40% by 2030 might even be more challenging, but there are other options for doing that we're not considering. We wonder about the possibility of ZEV mandates for trucks. I think there's more research needed to really speak to that. Fiscal measures may be a possible alternative, but we're going to need something that pushes very hard to push these into the market. There's a bunch of different research extensions. Some of this is being done by a range of other researchers around the country, but we are very interested in and are planning to look at truck buyer decisions and responses to different economic offers in terms of trucks and other parameters in the marketplace. We're going to be starting that study soon. We think we need some robustness analysis. We used point estimates here partly because we couldn't even figure out a way to characterize the uncertainty, and there is a lot of uncertainty in terms especially of the cost part of the analysis. We think regional disaggregation would be useful. Where do trucks operate, especially for California, and especially if you're thinking about air pollutants. And finally, obviously the role of VMT reduction and various in-use efficiency measures are things that we really need to elucidate, and that's something we may try to get into at the as a follow-on to this study. So with that, I thank you, and I know we've run quite a bit over time, but I'll hand it back to Laura and try to get us back on track.
Great. Thank you so much, Lou and Marshall. There's just so much to share, not enough time. But now I'd like to invite our respondents, our special guest respondents, Todd Sachs and Bill Van Amberg, to provide opening comments and reaction to Lou and Marshall's presentation. And maybe I'll point to Todd first to give your reaction.
Okay. Well, thank you. I hope you all can hear me. And thanks to UC Davis for a thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. Obviously, at ARB, we've been wrestling with these issues for a while, and we have a number of policy constructs that have been developed to focus on this, and UC Davis touched on a few. The vision work we've done, obviously there's the ZEV action plan, our sustainable freight strategy, and then we're working on state implementation plan development. I think we agree that zero and near zero technologies are going to be necessary to be able to achieve this goal. And the scenarios that you all have presented, I think, sort of bookend that discussion in terms of what technologies could be used and how we might meet 2050. I think, obviously, the analysis raises a lot of questions about how this could be done, and I think that's where I'd like to focus my first question, which is, in the process of developing the scenarios, a key issue to this is timing. And so how do you see when the key sort of time frames are to start having some mileposts or some decisions on when technologies need to be developed and commercially available and start entering the market in order to have the possibility of meeting the 2050 targets?
Okay, so we'll go into a back and forth. That's cool. I think, the way we are looking at it, if you think of 5-year time blocks here, we are saying in a ZEV-dominated scenario, you'd better be having ZEVs hit markets, and this is across a range of different truck market classes and a range of applications and duty cycles around 2020 or shortly thereafter, because that's the only way. If you think of the electric vehicle transitions that we've seen over the last 5 years, we really had sort of the reboot of electric vehicles around 2010, and here we are in 2015 at something like 1% market share. But those 5 years have been critical as a testing period and a learning period, and then hopefully we'll see electric vehicles in the light-duty sector rise fairly rapidly in the next 5 years. I think for ZEV trucks, it would look something like that starting in 2020, and by 2025, we'd need to be ready for a really rapid ramp-up. It'd be nice to start sooner, but I also think probably this coming 5 years is the time when we need the demonstration projects, a lot of really small stuff to figure out exactly how we want to really introduce these things in a bigger way in 2020. So that's pretty much how we see it. You could do it different ways, but you can't delay much more than that.
Thank you. I think probably I'll let Bill ask some questions, and we'll see how the questions with the audience, and if I need to ask more, I can.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Bill?
Yeah, so Lou and Marshall, this was a really tough landscape to navigate, and I'm really glad you pointed out the VMT component of all this is needed, but it just wasn't part of the scope, and fully realized the difficulty of that limited scope. I think a couple of observations that I would make, and you rightly alluded to this as you kind of go down the road, I think there are a few things that need to be included in the scenarios. I was really surprised by the low estimate of natural gas in the heavy-duty space, particularly with the availability of a drop-in fuel that's low carbon there, which is renewable natural gas. So I think that's definitely a point that I think deserves more look. I think particularly in California, we've looked at renewable natural gas hybridization as well as RNG, range extended electric, which could be a complement or a competition to fuel cell in some applications. And I think with low NOx engines in California at least, that's one of the scenarios, because the natural gas engine is certainly one of the good tools to potentially get to low NOx operations as well. But I do think your core observations, no matter how it's totally aggregated, I think you really hit it spot on. I mean, it's really important, and we saw this with our CalHeat market transformation roadmap. It's really important to consider this mixed scenario to give us the time to ramp up all of the tools. And I think some people have overused all of the above options, but I think we do need a strong mix, particularly if you're looking at the national marketplace. And this huge contribution of ultra-low carbon biofuels, I think, is a really critical highlight that you bring out. I think it's very important for us to keep that on the table because I really believe, based on our CalHeat work, that we saw a tremendous need for a very large introduction of low carbon biofuels together with electrification and electric drive as we get out towards that 2050 point. I think the steep ramp-up curve you also point out, I think, is also very critical. I think it's a gut check to all of us to see if this is where we really need, if this is the trajectory we need to get on for certain of these options to be available. I think ARB is doing a lot of the right stuff right now, and certainly its use of the greenhouse gas reduction funds in terms of its investment plan is really smart. But it does point out that we're going to be needing more policy tools, and I know people don't want to hear this across the nation, but God forbid, potentially new regulations or signals of regulations so people get a clear sense of what's going to be needed if we're really going to make the transition and the transformation that you point out. I think the electrical grid transformation, though, does point out some interesting opportunities. I think we're not making as many strides on fuel cell use in the truck space as you point out would be needed based on your high scenario for ZEV. But there certainly will be some potential to generate the hydrogen from renewable sources with the added capacity of renewables on the grid and the time shift of when that extra capacity is available. So I think there's really some interesting options there that at least could assist with this tough transformation. I would add one other observation, and then I'd love to throw a question at you. But the observation is, we've been involved, obviously ARB is very involved in the Phase 2 fuel economy and GHG rules that EPA and NHTSA are developing. And it's been my perception is that while those may be strong and they may lead, we would hope towards a near doubling or a doubling of fuel efficiency over this time period. I don't think, at least from a compliance perspective, those standards are likely to push anything as aggressive as the ZEV ramp up. It may drive some initial electrification. So I think this would be really strong, important. The study is very important for the EPA and NHTSA folks to look at just from their understanding of maybe some of the transformation needed. Let me just ask one question then after kind of that little observation. In your biofuel total assumptions, and I know you were more focused on drop-in renewable diesel and biodiesel options there, if RNG were to be considered, would you consider that as just one of the things that would be part of your existing biofuel assumptions, or do you think adding RNG would be additive, meaning adding some additional biofuel options?
Good question.
Okay, that last question actually ties in somewhat nicely with a few questions that we got online. So let me read those. They're all related to biofuels, and I'll try to kind of answer them all together. One question was, did you look at biomass production potential and constraints? Some for green electricity. Same for green electricity, tricky unless you include nuclear. And another question was, I did not see much CNG in the projections. Why? So these all have to do with natural gas and potentially renewable natural gas, and the biofuels in general. We did not attempt to look at constraints of either drop-in diesel or renewable natural gas. In other words, we recognize that certainly it may be problematic to produce enough very low carbon biofuels to meet the scenario, the mixed scenario that we had. And we did not attempt to go back and say, are the amounts we need reasonable or expected to be available in the 2040, 2050 timeline. So that's something that needs to be folded into the future study. In terms of CNG, there is this question of whether you would want to use LNG or CNG. People are obviously looking at both. CNG does have the advantage that with spark ignition engines, it is easier with three-way catalysts to get to the lower criteria pollutant NOx requirements, and that is a very significant benefit. So a lot of people are looking really at CNG in the sort of 10-year, well, presently, but also in the 10-year time frame to get to the really low NOx targets. Initially, that CNG, of course, could be produced, use fossil CNG, but as you get later, after 2030, 2040, you need to start transitioning very significantly to renewable natural gas. One of the concerns with using natural gas rather than diesel, not that it's a huge concern, is that it does require different technology engines. So you start to have more vehicles in the fleet. Instead of looking at just, for example, diesel, maybe moving to a maximum technology diesel and then to fuel cells or maybe battery electrics, you start to add another technology, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just another thing in the mix. As we said in this paper, we have really chosen to look more at fuel cells and biodiesel, and we have shelved renewable natural gas. We are currently looking at it in another study. We did not include it here just because we didn't feel that we had as much information in order to include it. And it is, in some sense, it has similar characteristics, problems, and issues as biodiesel.
And this is Lou just jumping in, and I do think the other feature of what we're calling the mixed scenario is that the advantage of the drop-in renewable diesel is that it works for every truck out there today, every diesel truck out there today, and it takes away the vehicle transition problem or postpones it, and certainly gives you more time to ramp up on ZEVs if you don't need as many of them. If you go to a renewable natural gas strategy, natural gas to renewable natural gas, then you also are going to have to change your truck fleet, which you can do, but you lose that one major advantage in terms of not having as big a deal on the truck side. So we have a big pile of questions, and
I'll
throw one out?
Throw one out here that we're getting from the audience. We have a couple looking at liquid hydrogen.
Okay.
And so one is asking to expand on the choice of liquid hydrogen for long-haul heavy-duty trucks, and they're pointing to slide 12. And then again, also expanding on talking about hydrogen use today.
Well, we have very little hydrogen use today for trucks. I mean, apart from there's some buses that are fuel cell hydrogen, and there are probably some trucks in fleets. I'm aware that some companies are interested in introducing fuel cell trucks in the next few years. So it's really a nascent situation on hydrogen in trucks as well as for cars. Now, we are getting a rollout this year in California on the car side. It's going to be very interesting, and this could help us begin to develop a hydrogen refueling infrastructure that eventually could be useful for trucks. So there is that connection, but there's a big lift here in terms of providing that refueling infrastructure, and on the vehicle side.
Great. So another question that we received from the audience is talking about fuel costs and won't that drive efficiency improvements without any additional greenhouse gas standards? And if there'd be comment on that one.
Okay, and that links to something else that one of our respondents said. I forget who said it, but the greenhouse gas and the fuel economy standards are really important because, in fact, no, I don't think that fuel prices are going to make this happen all by themselves. Now, it's possible if you had very high fuel prices that you would get a big response from truck companies and truck purchasing behavior But, basically, truck companies do not, they look for relatively low payback times. They're trying to make investments that pay back within a couple of years, and that's going to not give you anywhere near the efficiency improvements that you get through standards. And I think the big question is whether the national and the California standards, as they develop, are going to be strong enough to really push, as one of our respondents said, push us into new technologies. We may see some plug-in hybrid type vehicles that come along as these standards get tougher. Would we see fuel cell vehicles from that? I'm not confident. I think it would take a long time before standards really that are based on efficiency would push you that far. So that's why you might need complementary policies. But I do think that this all has to be fairly policy driven to reach the kinds of numbers that we're looking at here in 2030 and beyond.
Okay, another question online was, hydrogen has a low well-to-wheel efficiency. In order to use electricity more economically, have you considered direct supply to trucks? I assume that means battery electric trucks, as planned to be demonstrated by South Coast AQMD in the fall and by the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Yes, certainly we did. There are trade-offs between fuel cell and battery electric vehicles. A lot of our study focused on the Class 7 and Class 8 short-haul and long-haul trucks. Certainly for long-haul, the ranges the trucks drive are quite large, and battery electrics are, in our opinion, not really optimum for that. The battery storage would have to be so significant that I think would be problematic. So we really focused on fuel cell vehicles for that. And for short-haul, long-haul trucks and short-haul trucks are related. Typically, the long-haul trucking companies will buy new trucks and after 4 to 6 years sell them into the secondary market. And those secondary markets often end up being port trucks or day trucks, the short-haul trucks. So the same technologies they're going to enter the market near-term, well, mid-term, whatever, for long-haul, eventually get into short-haul. So we kept long and short-haul trucks as fuel cell vehicles almost exclusively, but of course it is true that you could have battery electrics in some of the short-haul applications, like especially port trucks. For the other trucks, for example, for pickups, we do show roughly 50% of the pickups in the fleet, the vehicle miles traveled, as battery electrics and 50% fuel cells by 2050. We think that's certainly possible. For other trucks with relatively modest fuel requirements or more modest fuel requirements, battery electrics are possible. We did have them in our top HDV scenarios, less so than fuel cells. But obviously, wherever battery electrics can play a role, it is certainly reasonable to look at those.
Okay, with that, I also want to tap into our special guest respondents. So Todd and or Bill, one, feel free to jump in and respond to some of these questions too, but I also want to invite any other additional questions you might have that we can get to before we close today.
This is Todd Sachs. I have one question, I guess. And Lou, you touched on this a little bit, which is the role of criteria pollutants. But, in California, obviously, we have the most severe challenges with criteria pollutants and ozone in particular, and NOx plays a big role in that. But with the potential for reduced ozone standards across the country, we think more and more states are going to be needing additional NOx reductions. When you look at your scenarios, how do you think the need for NOx reductions would impact some of the decision points in the transition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there is a tendency to see California as different. I mean, you have the most severe non-attainment situation in the country, but other states also have some non-attainment areas, and things keep getting tightened over time. So I think, in a way, these two scenarios simply do give you a sense of, if NOx and other air quality concerns rise to the level that you don't think you can achieve them with diesel vehicles, even with actually very, very clean drop-in renewable diesel, which it might well not be able to meet NOx requirements over time, then it pushes you toward the ZEV strategy. And I guess for any part of the country, that would be a trade-off that the local policymakers would want to look at and trucking companies would want to look at. And I wouldn't want to predict how that's going to play out, but that could definitely swing it one way or another.
I just had one other question, which related to the fuel constraints issue you talked about. There have been studies done by DOE, the billion-ton study, and there have been a recent study by UC Irvine, I think, on the prospects for renewable natural gas. And so, how do you think fuel constraints, or the possibility of fuel constraints, should influence policy decisions in the next 10 years as we try to encourage the development of these newer technologies to be able to move towards the transition?
Well, one of the concerns that we didn't really talk about directly in our talk is that biofuels can be used as a substitute for zero-emission vehicles to lower greenhouse gases. But the one concern is that biofuels may be needed even more so in other modes, such as air travel, ships, modes where moving to an electric vehicle, whether it's battery electric or fuel cell, may be extremely difficult. So if you have a fixed amount of biofuels, the question is how much of that is going to be needed in other modes, in air or in shipping or so on. We can't assume that a very large percentage of that can be used for trucks. And so in the back of our minds, we're thinking, well, we have to make sure that to the extent we use biofuels, it's available in these other modes. Maybe we don't want to focus so much on that for trucking.
Yeah, and I don't remember offhand what the billion-ton study would say in terms of total overall biofuels potential. I've seen many studies that suggest, globally that there is sufficient biofuels potential to have a global biofuel strategy. I think in a way almost the bigger question is, can you do it sustainably? Can you do it where you don't have a lot of indirect land use change impacts, where you don't have soil degradation? I mean, there are plenty of pathways that look very promising, and I think it's at least I don't feel competent to answer whether there's enough of them and that they could produce enough biofuels to achieve this scenario, and as Marshall says, with a lot of biofuels in other modes as well. And I think another part of it is the ramp-up rate. We're still, we've been for 20 years we've been close to having our first medium to large scale cellulosic ethanol plants, and we're really beginning to get to that now. But it's taken a long time, and I think to think of large scale production of advanced biofuels, even by 2030, how fast can we get there, and how expensive will it be? I think those are also very important considerations.
All right, thank you so much. And then, Bill, do you have a last question that we might be able to answer in the couple minutes we have left?
I will work within those constraints, yes. just one last observation, because I think your mixed scenario really points out something that is potentially, while difficult, actionable with a lot of moving parts in it. And I think there's some other considerations to add into it. But how important do you think is the missing element, which is a total system efficiency and VMT reduction? It feels like that's the last leg of the stool that's not included. If we could, in essence, reduce the need for as much fuel burn, and then of that fuel burn, make it of this reduced climate impact type, that would be the ideal scenario. How do you think that fits in? I know you didn't study it, but how big a missing piece do you think it is?
Well, I could be hypothetical. I mean, I think if you're thinking about targets, and since in 2050 this whole study's around targets, so it's a backcast really. What does it take to get there, or what are some of the ways to get there? If you could cut the baseline travel projection of trucks by a quarter, that would, and everything else were the same as in our scenarios, that would cut your fuel requirements by a quarter. It would be very helpful. It could even maybe buy you time on the penetration of the ZEVs and the advanced biofuels. If you could further improve on-road efficiency by some percentage, 20% off of the already big improvements we've got for the technologies. But if you have a various automation and logistic improvements that improve efficiency by 20%, that's another 20% less fuel that you need. So that's the critical contribution of those things from an energy and climate point of view. And of course, hopefully they are also providing important congestion reduction benefits and safety benefits and that sort of thing.
Great. Thank you so much. I hope everyone can join me in a cyber applause for our speakers today and our respondents. They did a fantastic job given how big this topic is. A lot more questions still yet to be answered. So please, for everyone, look in your emails. We're going to be sending a follow-up email that will include links to today's presentation and the recording. Also include a link to an evaluation survey. Please take a moment to share feedback on how this webinar went. If you have additional questions, we'd really enjoy that. If you want to keep the conversation going, we will be having a Freight and Sustainable Communities Forum with our partners UC Riverside down in UC Riverside on May 12th. So we'll also put a link to that information. So again, thank you for everyone. Bill and Todd, thank you. And a special thanks to Bill and Todd. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your feedback and reaction. So again, thank you everyone, and this concludes our webinar for today.